Okay, we're back with Chapter 1, Volume 2, Introduction to Psychology. We were talking about the Big Six, and I didn't want to leave you hanging the story of Jean Piaget. Check this out. Gets his doctorate in zoology. A fascinating story about him was he was a great observer. He was walking around his neighborhood and saw an albino sparrow. Now, apparently these are pretty rare because I've never seen one, and I've only heard of one person who claimed to have seen one in nearly 30 years. He writes up his observations, he submits it to a professional journal, they publish his article, somebody reads the article, says this guy's got it going on, offers Jean Piaget a job. He has to turn it down. Why? He's 9 years old. Okay, cool story, but what does that have to do with the cognitive perspective? This notion that behavior is tied to our thinking processes. Well, he has kids, and he observes his children and their thinking processes and realizes his kids think in certain ways, right or wrong, and patterns, what he calls later the cognitive stage theory. So change your way of thinking, change your destiny. Next school, psychobiological perspective. Remember, mess with the brain and body, change your behavior. Roger Sperry, Oliver Sacks. Let's talk about Sperry first. Sperry worked with so-called split brain patients, patients that were suffering from seizures, medication, other forms of treatment weren't helping. So they cut the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is a C-shaped structure that separates the right and left hemispheres. Theory was there was too much stimulation going back and forth, so if they cut it, they could reduce or eliminate the seizures. It worked for a lot of patients. But you had patients who, because their hemispheres weren't talking to each other anymore, would say things like, I'm not wearing my Spider-Man t-shirt today, as they're putting it on. Oliver Sacks is my favorite neurologist of all time. He passed away a couple years back. I've read most of his publications. A couple of his publications nearby. Awakenings, which is an excellent book and an interesting movie starring the late Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. And this other publication, which I'll show you momentarily. Sacks describes an interesting case where he meets a music professor who can no longer identify his students by their facial features. If they sing something, he knows who they are, but he can't identify them by their faces. So he gives them a standard neurological test, and he's unable to identify any problems until the music professor goes into the lobby, goes up to his wife, grabs his wife's head, starts pulling at it, and Dr. Sacks says, what are you doing? He says, I'm getting my hat. He goes on to write that case called, in his book, called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and other clinical tales. Highly recommend this book. Very fascinating. All the things that can go wrong with the brain. Turns out the good music professor had a tumor affecting his occipital lobe, which of course interferes with one's visual processing, right? Now, the last school of the Big Six, the psychobiological perspective, the sociocultural perspective, the fourth force starting around the 1960s, recognizing the behaviors tied to our culture. Folks like the Sioux brothers and Amado Padilla. Sioux brothers are an interesting case because their parents immigrated from China and didn't really know what a psychologist was, but yet three of their sons became very prominent psychologists, right? And they argued, along with folks like Amado Padilla, that one size does not fit all. When researching, when offering services to individuals, you have to consider their culture. We're a product of our culture. People judge a book by its cover all the time. Our society is dealing with cultural conflicts all the time. If we look at our history, this is not a new phenomenon. This is a very common phenomenon. So this perspective is called the fourth force because it had a huge impact when people started recognizing we have to consider language, we have to consider different religions, we have to consider practices as to what's appropriate services to give to individuals. Right? When you go, if you do pursue and see a psychologist, you should recognize that there are many different types of psychologists. Here's a smattering of some of the different types of psychologists that you may encounter. Now, you notice they have different names and different responsibilities. So if you're interested in a field, in the field of psychology, and you have questions, talk to different professors, talk to different people who are practicing as a psychologist, find out exactly what do you do? What is your day-to-day activity like? For example, my wife is a licensed clinical psychologist, so she sees people in therapy. But there are other individuals like industrial organizational psychologists who might consult with businesses to find out what are some of the best ways to increase productivity from their employees. You'll have forensic psychologists, which you see from time to time on the television programs if you watch some of those crime shows. Talk to these people individually to find out, is it really like on the television shows? What do you do exactly? Right? You can see a breakdown of where psychologists work in the community once they have their advanced degrees. And you can get associates, you can get bachelors, you can get masters, you can get doctorate degrees in psychology and do a variety of different things. Licensure varies from state to state, and academic requirements vary depending on the position. But my philosophy is the more education you get, the more doors open up for opportunities. Okay, so let me give you a review of what to expect for the first exam coming from Chapter 1. Now, when I first started teaching, I would tell people, study everything and just be prepared. But that just put a lot of anxiety onto students unnecessarily. So I thought, let me narrow it down and actually give some clues as to what the questions are going to be like. So here's some guidance as to what the questions are going to be like. And there won't be any surprises. I won't show you a bunch of review items and like the exam is completely different. I always hated when professors would do stuff like that. So the first question I want you to be cognizant and be prepared to write about, and we've talked about this, is to be able to talk about those big six in detail. Not only talking about how they described behavior, but when they got started, who were some famous people associated with the schools that I brought up in my lecture. Right? Remember, these are our neighbors that live down the street, so we want to know as much, and I want you to be able to talk about as much as you can about them. And hopefully you've been taking notes during the first two videos, so you'll be well prepared to answer those questions. And there's nothing wrong with doing additional research for the short answer essays. Again, my philosophy is more is better than less. So pretend like I'm Forrest Gump, the character that Tom Hanks played. Pretend like I don't know the answer and show me that you completely explain it thoroughly to me so I can understand the answer to the essay. So that's the first question from Chapter 1. Another question from Chapter 1 deals with your ability to define and give examples of 4 different types of psychologists. One of them is clinical, another one is industrial organizational, another one is feminist, and another one is forensic psychology. So, just a heads up, you're probably not going to find the big 6 in Chapter 1. That's typical for some of my questions. They come strictly from the lecture, right? From my own experiences, you'll hear case studies throughout the semester. Those typically aren't going to be found in the book. But the second question can be found in the book. It doesn't mean I don't discuss some of the issues, but this is the purpose of taking those good, thorough notes. You've gotten some of these definitions written down already, so that'll help you answer those questions. So I'm looking forward to lecturing on Chapter 2. I hope you enjoy Chapter 1. Some people don't like Chapter 1 because they said, oh, it's just a bunch of history, and I'm not interested in history. But I would say, nah, I think you are interested in history, because when you meet somebody you're interested in, the first thing you ask them about is their history. So it's all perspective, right? Hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed doing it. It was several takes because I kept on accidentally pressing the stop button multiple times. So I'll see you next time.